Tenure Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents 1,000 Days, John F. Kennedy in the White House, by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., narrated by Adam Verner. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. So of course it kills them. The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. Hemingway. Forward to the 2002 edition. This book was written in the grim months after John F. Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963. 1,000 Days has the advantages and disadvantages of a book composed so soon after the fact. Immediacy gives it vividness. It also gives a kind of knowledge denied those who were not around when history happened. As Alexis de Tocqueville once observed, participants understand better than posterity the movements of opinion, the popular inclinations of their times, the vibrations of which they can still sense in their minds and hearts. Posterity, of course, has its compensating advantages. A cooler perspective, knowledge of consequences, access to declassified documents and private papers, the diverse illuminations of hindsight. Also, as Mr. Dooley pointed out, ye are not subject to interruptions, be people who were there. History is a permanent debate, an argument without end, as Peter Geil, the eminent Dutch historian, put it. Historians, like everyone else, are prisoners of their own experience. Their priorities are shaped by the pressures of their time. Each new generation of historians has its distinctive preoccupations in the present, and, consequently, its distinctive demands on the past. The result is chronic fluctuation in historical verdicts. Reputations rise and fall like stocks on Wall Street, determined by the supply and demand equations of a later age. The reputation of the American presidents is particularly dependent on the climate in which historians hand down their judgments. In the conservative 1950s, I published The Crisis of the Old Order, the first volume of The Age of Roosevelt. The bitter politics of the 1930s had not yet abated, and many Americans still loathed that man in the White House. Conscious of the continuing hatred, I noted in the foreword that this was, I supposed, a bad time to be writing about FDR. The reputation of a commanding figure is often at its lowest in the period 10 to 20 years after his death. We are always in a zone of imperfect visibility, so far as the history just over our shoulder is concerned. It is as if we wrote in the hollow of the historical wave. Not until we reach the crest of the next one can we look back and estimate properly what went on before. Today, of course, recollected in tranquility, FDR is routinely rated by conservatives as well as by liberals as one of the 3 greatest American presidents. Some years after the publication of 1,000 Days, in November 1965, President Kennedy was in the hollow of the historical wave. His reputation was further buffeted by external events. The Vietnam War persuaded some scholars that U.S. foreign policy was inherently imperialistic. Watergate disillusioned them about presidential power. Kennedy revisionism gathered force. Critics dismissed him as charming but superficial, a triumph of style over substance, concerned with image rather than achievement, a man who talked big but accomplished little. In the darker version, Kennedy became an incorrigible philanderer, a reckless risk-taker in both private and public life, a bellicose fellow who ordered the assassination of foreign leaders, almost provoked a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, plunged the nation into the Vietnam morass, and, between needless international crises, turned the White House into a virtual bordello. When American Heritage magazine asked scholars in 1988 to name the single most overrated figure in American history, JFK received more votes than anyone else. One historian summed up the revisionist cause. His public relations approach to the presidency was an almost total disaster for the nation. The revelations of his private life have added more tarnish to the once golden image. Revisionism, it should be said, did not affect popular admiration of Kennedy. Ordinary Americans remembered a strong and stirring president who saved the peace in the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, assumed leadership in the struggle for racial justice, initiated the exploration of space, laid the foundation for federal aid to the arts and humanities, tapped the Republic's latent idealism, and infused a generation with a passion for public service. They cherished the idea of Camelot and its brief, shining hours. And recent years have seen a perceptible recovery of Kennedy's reputation among scholars. This is partly due to the passage of time. We are now on the crest of the next wave. And it is especially due to the documentation of Kennedy's leadership in the Cuban Missile Crisis in The Kennedy Tapes, 1997, edited by Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. Their 3-volume set, The Presidential Recordings, John F. Kennedy, The Great Crises, 2001, further enhances Kennedy's standing as a calm, thoughtful, resolute, and above all, substantive president. He glittered when he lived, and the whole world grieved when he was killed. Grief nourishes myth. The slain hero, robbed of fulfillment by tragic fate, is the stuff of legend. Myth breeds counter-myth. With the perspective of 40 years, we can perhaps disentangle myth and reality. Let us first dispose of Camelot. JFK had gone to Choate and Harvard with Alan J. Lerner. He liked Lerner, and he liked the songs Lerner wrote with Frederick Lowe for the popular 1960 musical. But during his lifetime, no one spoke of Kennedy's Washington as Camelot. Had anyone done so, no one would have been more derisive than JFK. Nor did those of us around him see ourselves for a moment as Knights of the Round Table. You will note the absence of Arthurian allusions in the text that follows. Camelot was Jacqueline Kennedy's grieving thought to the journalist Theodore H. White a week after her husband was killed. She thereby launched a myth that time turned into a cliché. Later, she told John Kenneth Galbraith that she feared she had overdone Camelot. For that matter, King Arthur's Camelot was hardly noted for marital constancy, and concluded in betrayal and death. Then a word about the 1960 election. A recurrent myth is that the Kennedys stole the election in Illinois, and that Richard Nixon's finest hour was his patriotic refusal to upset the nation by contesting the result. In fact, Illinois was not crucial to Kennedy's victory. Had he lost Illinois, Kennedy still would have won the Electoral College and the presidency by 270 to 246. And if Mayor Richard Daley's men stole votes in Cook County, Republicans stole votes downstate. The state electoral board, 4-1 Republican, voted unanimously to certify the Kennedy electors. An associated myth is that Joseph P. Kennedy made a deal in the winter of 1959-60 with a Chicago gangster named Sam Giancana to use trade unions under mob control to turn out the Chicago vote for his son. In fact, the only big union under mob influence was the Teamsters Union, and the Teamsters, led by Robert Kennedy's enemy, Jimmy Hoffa, were for Nixon. Giancana was known to the Kennedy family, but hardly in a way that would have made him an ally. Robert Kennedy, as counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee in 1958, succinctly described Giancana as chief gunman for the group that succeeded the Capone mob. Called before the Rackets Committee, Giancana declined to answer questions on the grounds that his answers might tend to incriminate him, and giggled as he declined. Robert Kennedy said bitingly, "I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana." In his book The Enemy Within, published in February 1960, Robert Kennedy portrayed Giancana in the most contemptuous terms. The idea is preposterous that a shrewd and experienced man like Joe Kennedy would make a deal with Sam Giancana and would regard the gangster and not Dick Daley as the key to Chicago politics. 15 months after Giancana giggled before the Rackets Committee, the Central Intelligence Agency, in its wisdom, signed him up in a plot to murder Fidel Castro. The Mafia had flourished in Havana under the indulgent Batista dictatorship, but Castro, after he came to power in 1959, closed the casinos and whorehouses and drove the mobsters from Cuba. This gave the mafiosi, as the CIA saw it, both the motives and the contacts to do the dirty deed without implicating the United States government. It was the Eisenhower administration that made the decision to bring in the mob, not, as the myth goes, the Kennedy administration. In September 1960, months before Kennedy became president, the CIA recruited Giancana. In October, the CIA installed him in a Miami hotel. My guess is that the CIA was doing all this on its own, confident that it knew the requirements of national security better than transient elected officials, and invoking the excuse of plausible deniability to justify the concealment of their plans from higher authority. No one has discovered that Eisenhower, or Kennedy after him, authorized the assassination projects. There is more to the Giancana story. In the course of the 1960 campaign, Frank Sinatra, a pal of Giancana's, introduced John Kennedy to an attractive young woman named Judith Campbell. Though her later claims were contradictory, and her story escalated with every telling, it seems that their affair extended into his presidency. She also had an affair with Giancana. How much did she tell Giancana about Kennedy? Did the Mafia have blackmail power over the president? If they did, they neglected to use it. Giancana was a major target in the war against organized crime, waged by Robert Kennedy's Department of Justice. Had Giancana ever had anything on the president, he would certainly have exploited it to save his hide when the feds were hot on his tail. Instead, his future was round-the-clock FBI surveillance, federal indictments, and a year in prison. The question remains about John Kennedy and women. His sexual waywardness does not constitute JFK's finest hour, but exaggeration is possible. Some think today that there was an unending procession of bimbos through Kennedy's White House, and that the Washington press corps knew about it, but covered up for him because newspaper men liked him, and because under the civilized rules of the day, a politician's private life was considered his own business. Vague rumors about JFK and women did waft about Washington from time to time, but as one who worked in the White House, I never saw anything untoward. Kennedy was a hard-working president, concentrating intently on the matters at hand. At no point in my experience did any preoccupation with women interfere with his conduct of the public business, apart from Caroline crawling under the presidential desk. Lest this ignorance be attributed to the invincible innocence of a professor, let me call another witness, that hard-bitten reporter Ben Bradley, then head of the Newsweek bureau in Washington, later the brilliant editor of the Washington Post. Bradley was not only at the center of Washington news gathering, he was also Kennedy's closest friend in the press. It is now accepted history, Bradley wrote in his 1995 memoir, A Good Life, that Kennedy jumped casually from bed to bed with a wide variety of women. It was not accepted history then. I was unaware of this proclivity during his lifetime. Who can really know about anyone else's sex life, unless one of the partners talks, or compromising letters turn up, or a third person is in the bedroom? An unlikely circumstance. No one can be certain what may have gone on between consenting adults. All this does not prevent sensation mongers writing with awesome certitude about the sex lives of famous people. Nor can outsiders pronounce on the inwardness of a marriage. My impression, shared by others from the Kennedy White House, is that JFK, for all his adventures, always regarded Jacqueline with genuine affection and pride. Their marriage never seemed more solid than in the later months of 1963. One sometimes hears the argument that recklessness in private life leads to recklessness in public life. But history shows no connection between private morals and public behavior. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, had wayward and sexual habits, but was all the same a tremendous moral force for his people and for his nation. On the other hand, Pol Pot of Cambodia was apparently devoutly religious and a faithful family man. All he did was to murder hundreds of thousands of his countrymen. The adultery test has limitations as a predictor of official conduct. In Kennedy's case, the argument that private recklessness leads to public recklessness is invoked to explain the Bay of Pigs and the CIA assassination plots against Castro. But these were initiatives of the Eisenhower administration, and no one has accused Ike of a reckless private life, at least since the Second World War. In fact, Kennedy was a cautious president, notable for his capacity to refuse escalation. When the Bay of Pigs invasion appeared to be failing, though under pressure from the military and the CIA to send in American forces, Kennedy declined to do so, as he later declined escalation in the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the missile crisis of 1962. The missile crisis was not only the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in all human history. Never before in the annals of life on this planet have two contending powers possessed between them the technical capacity to blow up the world. The tapes of the debate within the American government, not available when I wrote 1,000 Days, their existence not even suspected, show Kennedy's cool determination to expel the missiles without going to war. We know now that the Soviet forces in Cuba had tactical missiles equipped with nuclear warheads and the authority to use them in case of an American attack. Had Kennedy yielded to the pressure applied by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for an invasion, the result would probably have been nuclear war. Fortunately, after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy had little regard for the JCS and their recommendations. Instead, he steadily pursued and successfully achieved a diplomatic solution. It quickly became clear, Khrushchev wrote in his memoirs. He understood better than Eisenhower that an improvement in relations was the only rational course. Then came Vietnam. Though Kennedy increased the number of American military advisors attached to the South Vietnamese Army, he rejected every proposal to send in American combat units. The last thing he wanted, said General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was to put in ground forces. Both Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, and McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, said later that in their judgment, Kennedy would never have Americanized the war, though they advised President Johnson to do exactly that, and he, with deep misgivings, followed that advice, thinking that that was what Kennedy would have done. Kennedy believed that in the end American influence in the world depended less on American arms than on American ideals. Undertakings like the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress were closest to his heart. And he believed, too, that Americans must live up to their own ideals. He regretted that he had to spend so much time on foreign policy. Each day, he said, was a new crisis. He looked forward to a second term in which he could concentrate on domestic problems, especially in combating poverty, enlarging economic opportunity, and promoting racial justice. Actually, Kennedy, in his 1,000 Days, compiled a pretty good record in domestic policy, as Professor Irving Bernstein showed in his book Promises Kept, John F. Kennedy's New Frontier, 1991. Kennedy came slowly to appreciate the intensity of Black America's demand for full citizenship, and by 1963 he made himself, at distinct political cost, the leader of the movement for new civil rights legislation. "We are confronted," he said, "primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution." He made his share of mistakes. There was an excessive New Frontier faith in activism, a conviction that if there was a problem, there must be a solution, and let's do it now. But he never lost the capacity to learn from his mistakes. Each year he became a better president. Most important was the impact Kennedy had on a new generation of Americans. His irreverence toward conventional ideas and institutions provoked a discharge of critical energy throughout American society. At Kennedy's behest, bright, idealistic, and capable young men and women, asking not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country, entered politics and public service. JFK liked to quote John Buchan, "Politics is still the greatest and the most honorable adventure." He offered young people the faith that individuals can make a difference to history. The Kennedy generation brought new ideas, hopes, vision, generosity, and vitality to the national life. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in his 1,000 days, gave the country back to its own best self. And he taught the world that the process of rediscovering America was not over. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Forward. This work is not a comprehensive history of the Kennedy presidency. It is a personal memoir by one who served in the White House during the Kennedy years. A personal memoir, at best, can offer only a partial view. The presidency is such a complex institution that only the president himself can fully know his problems and his purposes. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had intended to write the history of his own administration. No one else will ever be able to achieve the central, the presidential, perspective on these years. Even the public official closest to Kennedy, then the Attorney General of the United States, looking at the White House papers after his brother's death, was astonished at the variety of presidential issues he had not known about before. A presidential associate, moreover, inevitably tends to overrate the significance of the things he does know about. Grace Tully, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal secretary, acutely observed of the books written by the men around FDR, "None of them could know that for each minute they spent with the president, he spent 100 minutes by himself, and 1,000 more with scores of other people, to reject, improvise, weigh, and match this against that, until a decision was reached." This book, for example, deals largely with foreign affairs, and only occasionally records President Kennedy's intense feeling about his own country, and his deep desire to improve the quality of life and opportunity in the United States. This was an animating purpose of his presidency, but as one only irregularly involved in these matters, I have less to say about them. Similarly, others will have to describe in greater detail President Kennedy's relations with Congress and with party politics. The presidential perspective on this administration is now tragically and irretrievably lost. But sometime in the future an historian, today perhaps a very young man, will read the volumes of reminiscence and analysis, immerse himself in the flood of papers in the Kennedy Library, and attempt by the imaginative thrust of his craft to recover that perspective. He will not attain it, but he will do the best he can on the basis of the evidence and his own insight, to reproduce the form and color and motion of the years as they unrolled before the occupant of the Oval Room. I hope that this and similar books published in the time between may advance his task. A number of my colleagues in the Kennedy administration helped check and supplement my own recollections as I worked on this book, and I am deeply grateful for their assistance. But the reconstruction of past events is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, and when I have been confronted by diverging judgments and memories, I have had no choice but to consider the evidence as best I could and draw conclusions on my own responsibility. Therefore I am, as author, totally and exclusively accountable for the shape that incidents and people assume in this narrative. I do wish, however, to express special thanks to Nancy Riley Newhouse for valuable assistance on research, and to Gretchen Stewart for devoted and unstinting help in every aspect of this undertaking. This work is based on papers, as well as on interviews and recollections. Every statement, I believe, has its warrant, but in order to protect confidential communications, it has seemed better not to give a systematic indication of sources at this time. A fully footnoted manuscript will be deposited under seal in the Kennedy Library, along with my own White House papers. After an appropriate interval, these will be open to scholars. Many of the quotations come from a journal I kept through these years. At the start of his administration, President Kennedy said that he did not want his staff recording the daily discussions of the White House. Remarks tossed off gaily or irritably in conversation, he knew, looked very different in print. He mentioned Henry Morgenthau's solemn chronicling in his diaries of Franklin Roosevelt's jocosities during the gold-buying episode of 1933, and he wished no restraint on his own freedom of expression. Accordingly, my White House notes for the first weeks were fragmentary. Then after the Bay of Pigs, he said, "I hope you kept a full account of that." I said that I had understood he did not want us to keep full accounts of anything. He said, "No, go ahead. You can be damn sure that the CIA has its record and the Joint Chiefs theirs. We'd better make sure we have a record over here, so you go ahead." I did. None of this, I fear, can come close to recapturing the exceptional qualities of John F. Kennedy as a man and as a president. But I hope it will suggest something of the way in which he quickened the heart and mind of the nation, inspired the young, met great crises, led our society to new possibilities of justice, and our world to new possibilities of peace, and left behind so glowing and imperishable a memory. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Washington, D.C., February 4th, 1965. Prologue, January 1961. It all began in the cold. It had been cold all week in Washington. Then early Thursday afternoon the snow came. The winds blew in icy, stinging gusts and whipped the snow down the frigid streets. Washingtonians do not know how to drive in the snow. They slide and skid and spin their wheels and panic. By 6 o'clock traffic had stopped all over town. People abandoned their cars in snowdrifts and marched grimly into the gale, heads down, newspapers wrapped around necks and stuffed under coats. And still the snow fell, and the winds blew. At 8 o'clock the young president-elect and his wife went to the inaugural concert at Constitution Hall. An hour later they left at the intermission to go to the inaugural gala at the Armory. The limousine made its careful way through the blinding snow down the mall. Bonfires had been lit along the path in a vain effort to keep the avenue clear. Great floodlights around the Washington Monument glittered through the white storm. It was a scene of eerie beauty. As stranded motorists cheered the presidential car, the president-elect told his friend, William Walton, "Turn on the lights so they can see Jackie." With the light on inside the car, he settled back to read Jefferson's first inaugural, which had been printed in the concert program. When he finished, he shook his head and said wryly, "Better than mine." By midnight, the city was choked with snow. Workmen labored to clear Pennsylvania Avenue for next day's parade. Soldiers used flamethrowers to melt the frozen drifts around the inaugural stand in the Capitol Plaza. At 3:45 in the morning, the president-elect returned to his house in Georgetown, from a supper given him downtown by his father after the gala. His wife, recuperating from the birth of their second child, had gone home hours earlier, but he found her awake, too excited to sleep, and they talked for a moment about the day that had passed and the day yet to come. Toward dawn, the snow began to stop. It covered houses and clung to trees, and filled the wind-swept streets. The white city faintly shimmered in the pale sunrise. The president-elect arose at 8, read over the text of his inaugural address, pencil in hand, and then left to attend Mass at a neighboring church. The crowd began to gather in the Capitol Plaza long before noon. At 11, the president-elect and his wife drank coffee with the retiring president and vice president and their wives in the Red Room of the White House. They talked formally and inconsequentially. In morning coats and top hats, They entered limousines to drive along the snowy streets to the Capitol. The wife...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?